I'm Cory Brandon, 29, and I spent 8 years behind bars for a murder I didn't commit. The day they sentenced me to life without parole, I watched Detective Raymond Walsh shake hands with the prosecutor, his face a mask of satisfaction. What I didn't know then was that Walsh had killed my girlfriend Sarah himself and orchestrated every piece of evidence that put me away. The betrayal was devastating, but the truth I uncovered from my prison cell would not only free me, it would expose a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of our justice system. Some stories of injustice end in bitterness, but mine ends with the kind of justice that restores your faith in what's possible. When you refuse to give up. If you've ever felt trapped by a system designed to silence you, subscribe for stories of truth prevailing against impossible odds. The night Sarah died, I was 30 miles away at my brother's bachelor party in Riverside. We'd been celebrating since 6 in the evening. Bowling, dinner, then back to Mike's apartment for drinks and card games. I remember checking my phone around 11:30 and seeing Sarah's last text. Working late again. These files are making my head spin. Love you. See you tomorrow. I smiled when I read it, knowing how dedicated she was to her work as a forensic accountant. Sarah had always been meticulous about everything, from organizing our shared calendar to color-coding her case files. She'd been putting in extra hours recently, something about irregularities she'd discovered in some financial records. Teased her about becoming obsessed with numbers, but she just laughed and said someone had to keep the books honest. The party went until almost 2 in the morning. I crashed on Mike's couch, too tired and slightly buzzed to drive home. My phone was dead-eyed, forgotten my charger, so I plugged it in and fell asleep immediately. When I woke up around 8, I had 17 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. The first callback changed everything. A detective's voice, professional but grim. "Mr. Brandon? This is Detective Walsh with the Metro Police. You to come to the station immediately? It's about Sarah Chen." My hand started shaking before he even finished the sentence. The drive to the station felt like it took hours, though it was only 20 minutes. Detective Walsh met me in the lobby. A tall man with graying temples and tired eyes that seemed to see everything. He looked exactly like what you'd expect from a veteran detective, the kind who'd seen too much, but still cared about justice. "Mr. Brandon, I'm very sorry to tell you this, but Sarah was found dead in her apartment early this morning. We're treating this as a homicide." The words hit me like a physical blow. Sarah? Dead? It couldn't be real. Just hours ago, she'd been texting me about work files. We'd made plans for the weekend, talked about taking a trip to see her parents. Next month? People don't just do not, people like Sarah. Not when everything was finally going right for us. "I don't understand," I managed to say. She was working late. She sent me a text around 11:30. Walsh's expression shifted slightly, and he pulled out a small notebook. "Can you show me that text?" I fumbled with my phone, hands still trembling, and showed him Sarah's final message. He photographed the screen with his own phone, then asked me to walk him through my entire evening. Every detail, every person who could verify my whereabouts. Every time I'd checked my phone. "This is just standard procedure," he assured me. "We need to establish a timeline." The neighbors reported hearing what sounded like an argument around midnight, then silence. "Your alibi helps us narrow down our investigation." I gave him everything: Mike's address, the names of everyone at the party, even the receipt from the restaurant where we'd eaten dinner. Walsh wrote it all down carefully, his pen scratching against the paper with methodical precision. "We'll need to verify all of this, of course," he said, closing the notebook. "But I want you to know, Mr. Brandon, that we're going to find whoever did this to Sarah. She didn't deserve what happened to her." Looking back now, I realized that was the moment Detective Raymond Walsh looked me in the eye and lied to my face. For the first time, not the last time, but the first. He already knew he was the one who'd killed Sarah, and he was already planning how to make me take the fall for his crime. The next few days passed in a blur of grief and confusion. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the image of Sarah's empty apartment that the police wouldn't let me enter. Detective Walsh called me every morning with updates, his voice always steady and professional. "We're making progress," he'd say. "The crime scene team found some promising evidence. We should have more answers soon." I trusted him completely. Why wouldn't I? He was the lead detective on Sarah's case, the man who'd promised to find her killer. When he asked me to come to the station for follow-up questions, I went willingly. When he requested DNA samples and fingerprints for elimination purposes, I complied immediately. "It's standard procedure," Walsh explained as the technician swabbed the inside of my cheek. We need to separate your DNA from any potential evidence since you've spent time in Sarah's apartment. The crime scene photos Walsh showed me during our third interview were devastating. Sarah's living room, where we'd watched movies just the weekend before, was destroyed. Furniture overturned, books scattered across the floor, her laptop smashed beyond repair. But what struck me as strange was how selective the destruction seemed. The bedroom was untouched. Kitchen was pristine. Even Sarah's expensive camera. Equipment remained perfectly arranged on her desk. Looks like whoever did this was looking for something specific, Walsh said, sliding the photos back into their folder. Any idea what Sarah might have had that someone would want? I shook my head, trying to process what I was seeing. She was working on some financial audit, but it was just routine corporate stuff. Nothing worth killing for. Walsh leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. Cory, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Had you and Sarah been having any problems lately? Any fights or disagreements? The question caught me off guard. No, nothing like that. We were happy. We're talking about getting engaged next year. No financial stress, no jealousy issues. Sometimes relationships have tensions that partners don't want to admit. I felt a flash of anger. Detective Walsh, I loved Sarah. We didn't have problems. I would never hurt her. He held up his hands in a calming gesture. I had to ask. It's part of the process. The thing is, Cory, some evidence has come to light that's concerning. Oh, my stomach dropped. What kind of evidence? Walsh pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the first. Sarah's neighbors reported hearing raised voices coming from her apartment around 11:15 the night she died. A man's voice, specifically. He couldn't make out words, but it sounded like an argument. That's impossible. I was at Mike's party. I showed you my phone. Sarah texted me at 11:30 saying she was working late. About that text, Walsh said, his tone shifting slightly. Our tech team analyzed Sarah's phone. The message you received was sent at 11:30, but it was composed and scheduled to send earlier that evening. Sarah wasn't actually at her apartment when you received it. The room started spinning. Nothing he was saying made sense. Scheduled? Sarah didn't know how to do that. She barely used half the features on her phone. We also found something in Sarah's apartment that we need to discuss. Walsh reached into the evidence folder and pulled out a plastic bag containing what looked like a piece of torn fabric. This was found clutched in Sarah's hand. The lab results just came back. It's a match for the shirt you were wearing 2 days ago when you first came to the station. I stared at the evidence bag, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The fabric did look familiar, a blue cotton blend that could have come from any number of shirts in my closet. But how could it have gotten into Sarah's apartment? How could it have been in her hand? There has to be some mistake, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't there. I have witnesses. You verified my alibi yourself. Walsh's expression had changed completely. The compassionate detective was gone, replaced by someone cold and calculating. Alibis can be fabricated, Cory. Friends lie for each other all the time. What I can't ignore is physical evidence. This is insane. You're making a mistake, am I? Walsh stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Because we also found your fingerprints on Sarah's front door handle on the inside of her apartment. Of course you did. I was her boyfriend. Spent time there almost every day. On the murder weapon, too. The words hit me like a physical blow. Murder weapon. Until that moment, Walsh had never told me how Sarah died. I'd assumed it was a robbery gone wrong, maybe a struggle that got out of hand. But the way he said murder weapon made it clear. This was something much worse. What murder weapon? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Walsh sat back down, his eyes never leaving my face. A kitchen knife from Sarah's own knife block. Your fingerprints are all over it, Cory. Clear as day. Of course my fingerprints were on Sarah's kitchen knives. I'd cooked dinner at her place dozens of times. This was evidence of our relationship, not of murder. But as I sat in that sterile interview room, watching Detective Walsh's satisfied expression, I realized that the truth didn't matter anymore. Someone had decided I was guilty, and they were building a case around that conclusion. I just didn't know yet that the someone was the man sitting across from me, the man I'd trusted. To find Sarah's real killer. They came for me at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, exactly 1 week after Sarah's funeral. I was still in my pajamas, drinking coffee and staring at the newspaper. I couldn't focus on reading. When the pounding started on my front door, through the peephole, I saw Detective Walsh, flanked by 4 uniformed officers. their faces grim and professional. "Cory Brandon, you're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Chen." The words felt surreal, like dialogue from a movie I was watching, rather than my own life being destroyed. Walsh held up the arrest warrant, a crisp white document with official seals and signatures that reduced my entire existence to a single accusation. As he read me my rights, his voice carried none of the sympathy he'd shown during our previous conversations. This was a different man entirely, or maybe this was who he'd always been. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." My neighbors began emerging from their houses, drawn by the commotion of police cars and flashing lights. Mrs. Patterson from next door stood on her porch in her bathrobe, her hand covering her mouth in shock. The Johnsons across the street had their teenage son's phone out, recording everything. By the time the handcuffs clicked around my wrists, half the neighborhood was watching Cory Brandon, Sarah's grieving boyfriend, being arrested for her murder. "This is a mistake," I kept saying as they led me to the patrol car. "Detective Walsh, you know this is a mistake. I was at my brother's party. You verified my alibi." Walsh leaned down as they put me in the back seat, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Alibis fall apart under scrutiny, Cory. Friends change their stories when they realize they're accessories to murder." The drive to the station took 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. I watched familiar streets pass by, through the cage that separated me from the front seat, trying to understand how my life had become unrecognizable so quickly. Just over a week ago, I'd been planning a future with Sarah. Now I was accused of killing her. The booking process was a humiliating parade of photographs, fingerprints, and property confiscation. They took my wallet, my watch, even the small silver cross my grandmother had given me for my confirmation. Everything that connected me to my identity as a free man was cataloged and locked away. "Phone call," the desk sergeant said, pushing an ancient-looking phone across the counter. I called my brother Mike first, my hand shaking as I dialed. "Mike, I need help." "They arrested me for Sarah's murder." The silence on the other end stretched. So long I thought the call had dropped. When Mike finally spoke, his voice was strained. "Cory, what the hell is going on?" "The police came to my apartment this morning. They said you lied about being at my party." "I didn't lie. I was there." "No, I was there. They said they have evidence that you left the party early. Said some of the guys remember you seeming agitated, talking about problems with Sarah." My stomach dropped. "Mike, that's not true. None of that happened. They showed me security footage from the gas station near Sarah's apartment. A car that looks like yours, around midnight." The line went quiet again. When Mike spoke next, his voice was different, distant, uncertain. "Cory, I want to help you, but I can't lie to the police. If they have evidence, you're my brother," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "You know I couldn't do this. I thought I knew that. But the police seem pretty sure, and they'd have a lot more information than I do." The call ended with Mike promising to find me a lawyer, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. Detective Walsh's prediction was already coming true. My alibi was crumbling as people began to question their own memories and trust the authority of law enforcement over their personal knowledge of my character. My second call was to a criminal defense attorney whose name I'd found in the phone book. Martin Kowalski had a gravelly voice and a no-nonsense attitude that should have been reassuring. "Charged you with first-degree murder," he said after I explained the situation. "That means they believe they have evidence of premeditation. The prosecution doesn't file those charges lightly." I didn't do it. I loved Sarah. I was planning to propose to her. That's what they all say, son. What matters is what we can prove in court. I'll need you to write down everything you remember about the night in question. Every person, every conversation. We're going to need all the help we can get. As they led me to my cell that first night, I caught a glimpse of Detective Walsh talking to a group of reporters who'd gathered outside the station. Through the window, I could see him gesturing with his hands, his face set in the expression of a dedicated public servant who'd brought a dangerous killer to justice. "We're confident we have the right man," his voice carried through the glass. "The evidence against Mr. Brandon is overwhelming. Sarah Chen's family deserves justice, and we're going to make sure they get it." Watching him perform for the cameras, seeing the satisfaction in his eyes as he described my guilt to the world, I felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't about justice for Sarah. This was about something else entirely. Something I didn't understand yet, but could feel in my bones. Detective Raymond Walsh wasn't just convinced I was guilty, he was pleased about it. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I started to wonder why. The county jail was a concrete maze of echoing voices, slamming doors, and the constant smell of disinfectant mixed with human desperation. My cell was 8 feet by 10 feet, containing a narrow bunk, a stainless steel toilet, and a small sink that dispensed lukewarm water. The walls were covered in scratched graffiti names, dates, crude drawings, and messages from previous occupants who'd waited here for their own encounters with justice. My cellmate was a man named Rodriguez who'd been arrested for drug possession. He was quiet, kept to himself, and seemed genuinely surprised when I told him what I was charged with. "Murder?" he said, looking me up and down. "You don't look like a killer, man. Look like somebody's accountant." "I didn't do it," I said, the words feeling hollow even to my own ears. Rodriguez shrugged. "That's what everybody says. But if you really didn't do it, you're in for a rough time. The system doesn't like admitting mistakes." The first meeting with my court-appointed attorney, Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the detective, just an unfortunate coincidence, took place in a cramped room with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sick. She was young, probably fresh out of law school, with an overwhelming caseload and the tired expression of someone who'd learned not to expect much from the criminal justice system. "I've reviewed the evidence," she said, spreading files across the small table between us. "Mr. Brandon, I'm going to be honest with you. The prosecution has a strong case. Your fingerprints on the murder weapon, physical evidence at the scene, and inconsistencies in your alibi." "What inconsistencies?" "I was at my brother's party. There were witnesses." She flipped through her notes. "Several party guests have given statements saying you seemed upset that night, that you mentioned having relationship problems with Sarah. Your brother now says he can't be certain you stayed the entire night. I felt like I was drowning. That's not true. None of that is true. There's also security camera footage from a gas station near Sarah's apartment showing a vehicle matching your car's description around midnight. Can they prove it was my car? Can they see the license plate? The footage is grainy, but the prosecution will argue it's consistent with their timeline." She closed the file and looked at me directly. "Mr. Brandon, the district attorney, is offering a plea deal. Second-degree murder, 25 years to life, with possibility of parole after 15. A plea deal? For a crime I didn't commit? Better than life without parole, which is what you're facing if we go to trial and lose. First-degree murder convictions are hard to overturn." I stared at her, trying to process what she was telling me. "You don't believe I'm innocent." She was quiet for a long moment. "Doesn't matter what I believe. What matters is what we can prove in court, and right now the evidence isn't in our favor." The days in county jail blurred together. Breakfast at 6, recreation time in a concrete yard surrounded by razor wire. Lunch at noon, more waiting. Dinner at 5, lights out at 10. I called my parents every day, hearing my mother cry and my father's voice grow more strained as the reality of my situation became clear. "We've hired a private investigator," my father said during one call. "Someone to look into the evidence, maybe find something the police missed." But I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice too. The evidence against me was overwhelming, and doubt was a virus that spread through everyone who cared about me. How well do you really know someone? Could the man they'd raised, the son they'd loved, really be capable of murder? The other inmates treated me with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Word spread quickly about what I was charged with, and killing your girlfriend was the kind of crime that didn't earn respect, even in jail. I kept to myself, read books from the small library, and tried not to think about Sarah. But at night, lying on the thin mattress, listening to the sounds of the jail around me, I couldn't stop thinking about Detective Walsh. His satisfied expression during our last interview, the way he'd seemed almost pleased when he arrested me, the careful precision with which he'd built his case, as if he'd known exactly what evidence he needed to find. During one particularly long night, staring at the ceiling while Rodriguez snored in the bunk below me, a terrible thought occurred to me. What if Walsh hadn't just built a case against me? What if he'd built the evidence itself? The idea seemed paranoid, impossible. Police officers investigated crimes they didn't commit. But the more I thought about it, the more questions arose. How had my fingerprints gotten on that piece of fabric in Sarah's hand? How had a security camera captured what might have been my car near her apartment when I knew I'd been 30 miles away? And most troubling of all, why had Walsh been so quick to dismiss my solid alibi? So eager to find holes in the testimony of people who'd known me for years. I started making lists in my head. trying to remember every detail of my interactions with Walsh, every question he'd asked, every piece of evidence he'd presented, every moment when his behavior had seemed slightly off. The pattern was subtle, but it was there, the methodical destruction of an innocent man's life by someone who knew exactly how the system worked. Prison intake form in hand. I was just another number in the system now. But lying in that cell, I made myself a promise. If I was going to spend the rest of my life behind bars for a crime I didn't commit, I was going to find out why. I was going to start with Detective Raymond Walsh. The trial began 6 months after my arrest, in a courtroom packed with reporters, Sarah's family, and curious onlookers drawn by the media coverage. District Attorney Helen Morrison had turned my case into a showcase of her office's commitment to domestic violence prosecution, though she carefully avoided using those exact words since Sarah and I had never lived together. Detective Walsh was the prosecution's star witness, taking the stand on the second day in a perfectly pressed suit, his badge gleaming under the courtroom lights. He spoke with the authority of a 20-year veteran, his voice steady and confident as he walked the jury through his investigation. When I first met Mr. Brandon, Walsh testified, he appeared genuinely distraught about Ms. Chen's death. As our investigation progressed, inconsistencies began to emerge in his story. Prosecutor Morrison guided him through each piece of evidence like a conductor leading an orchestra. The fabric found in Sarah's hand, my fingerprints on the murder weapon, the suspicious gaps in my alibi that had mysteriously appeared as witnesses changed their stories. Detective Walsh, in your professional opinion, based on 20 years of homicide investigation, what do you believe happened the night Sarah Chen was murdered? Walsh turned to face the jury, his expression grave and authoritative. Based on the physical evidence and witness testimony, I believe Mr. Brandon went to Miss Chen's apartment after leaving his brother's party. They argued possibly about their relationship, possibly about something else. The argument escalated, and in a moment of rage, Mr. Brandon took a knife from Ms. Chen's own kitchen and stabbed her multiple times. And the evidence supports this conclusion? Absolutely. Mr. Brandon's fingerprints were on the murder weapon. DNA evidence confirms he was at the scene. Physical evidence was found clutched in the victim's hand. The timeline matches witness observations. It's one of the most clear-cut cases I've worked in my career. I watched the jury as Walsh spoke, seeing doubt fade from their faces and certainty take its place. This wasn't just any detective testifying. This was Detective Raymond Walsh, whose conviction rate was legendary, whose reputation for thoroughness was unquestioned. When he said the evidence was clear-cut, people believed him. My attorney, Jennifer Walsh, did her best during cross-examination, but she was overmatched, and we both knew it. She questioned the reliability of eyewitness testimony and pointed out that my fingerprints on Sarah's kitchen knife could be explained by our relationship. But she couldn't explain away the fabric evidence, couldn't account for the security, camera footage, couldn't rebuild an alibi that had crumbled under police scrutiny. Detective Walsh, she said during her cross-examination, isn't it possible that Mr. Brandon's fingerprints were on the knife? Because he'd cooked dinner at Ms. Chen's apartment on previous occasions. It's possible, Walsh replied calmly. But the placement and clarity of those prints suggest more recent contact, consistent with the night of the murder. You testified that several witnesses changed their initial statements about Mr. Brandon's whereabouts that night. Isn't it unusual for so many people to be mistaken about the same thing? Walsh's expression remained unchanged. Memory is unreliable, especially when people have been drinking. When confronted with physical evidence, witnesses often realize their initial recollections were incorrect. She pressed harder. Detective Walsh, you've built your case entirely on circumstantial evidence. You have no witnesses to the actual murder, no confession, no clear motive. Isn't it possible you've arrested the wrong man? For just a moment, I saw something flicker across Walsh's face, not doubt, but something else. Satisfaction, maybe. Or amusement, counselor, he said. In my 20 years of experience, physical evidence doesn't lie. People do, but DNA doesn't. Fingerprints don't. Mr. Brandon's guilt is written in the evidence itself. The prosecution's case took for days to present. They brought in forensics experts who testified about the knife wounds, the blood spatter patterns, the DNA analysis. They showed crime scene photos that made the jury flinch. They painted a picture of a controlling boyfriend who'd killed his girlfriend in a rage and then tried to cover it up with an elaborate alibi. Our defense took barely 2 days. We had character witnesses who testified to my gentle nature, friends who insisted I could never hurt anyone, But we couldn't explain the physical evidence. Couldn't account for the inconsistencies in my story that seemed to multiply every time. Someone looked at them. Sarah's sister gave a victim impact statement that left half the courtroom in tears. "Sarah was the kindest person I knew," she said, looking directly at me. "She trusted you, she loved you, and you murdered her in cold blood." The worst part was that I could see the sincerity in her eyes. She truly believed I had killed her sister. Detective Walsh's case was so convincing, so meticulously constructed, that even people who'd known me for years were beginning to doubt my innocence. During closing arguments, Don Morrison summarized the evidence with prosecutorial precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a complex case. The defendant, Cory Brandon, murdered Sarah Chen in her own apartment, using her own kitchen knife. The evidence is overwhelming, the conclusion inescapable. The only question before you is whether you'll hold him accountable for this brutal crime." My attorney's closing was passionate but desperate. She asked the jury to consider reasonable doubt, to remember that circumstantial evidence requires interpretation, to consider that an innocent man's life hung in the balance. But I could see in their faces that the decision had already been made. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with their verdict, the foreman's voice was clear and certain: guilty of murder in the first degree. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following week, and I was led back to my cell knowing that my life was effectively over. But as I passed Detective Walsh in the hallway, I caught something in his expression that I hadn't noticed before: relief. Not the relief of a detective who'd solved a difficult case, but the relief of a man who'd successfully covered his tracks. For the first time since this nightmare began, I was certain of one thing: Detective Raymond Walsh knew I was innocent. And that meant he knew who was really guilty. The sentencing hearing lasted 20 minutes. Judge Margaret Chenot, relation to Sarah. Just another cruel coincidence delivered. The mandatory sentence for first-degree murder with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. "Mr. Brandon, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of murder in the first degree. The sentence for this crime is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You will be transferred to the state penitentiary to serve this sentence. May God have mercy on your soul." Wow. The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot, and just like that, my life was over. I was 29 years old, and I would die in prison for a crime I didn't commit. Marshals led me away in shackles, while Sarah's family wept in the gallery, not from grief this time, but from relief that justice had finally been served. The transfer to Millfield State Penitentiary took place 3 days later in an armored transport van with tiny windows that offered glimpses of a world I would never be part of again. The countryside rolled by: farms, small towns, normal people living normal lives, while I sat, chained to the floor, trying to accept that this was my reality now. Millfield was a fortress of concrete and steel surrounded by double fences topped with razor wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, their searchlights sweeping the yard in patterns that had been repeated for decades. As we passed through the first gate, the driver spoke without turning around. "Welcome to the end of the line, boys." The intake process at maximum security was more thorough and more humiliating than county jail. Strip search, medical examination, psychological evaluation, assignment to a cell block based on the nature of my crime and perceived threat level. Everything I owned fit into a single cardboard box: a few photos, some letters from family, the 3 books I'd been allowed to keep. My new cell was even smaller than the one at county jail, and my cellmate was a lifer named Marcus Williams, who'd been there for 8 years on a conviction for armed robbery that had gone wrong. Marcus was in his 40s, tall and lean, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog everything around him. "What you in for?" he asked as I arranged my few possessions on the narrow shelf above my bunk. "Murder 1, life without parole." He nodded, unsurprised. "You do it?" His question was direct, without judgment, and here guilt or innocence mattered less than survival. "No." Marcus studied me for a long moment. "How sure are you about that?" "What do you mean?" "Are you sure you didn't do it, or are you sure you don't remember doing it? Prison's full of innocent men, but it's also full of guys who've convinced themselves they're innocent because the alternative is too hard to live with." I met his gaze. "I'm sure. I loved her. I was planning to marry her, and the evidence was fabricated. I think the detective who investigated the case is the one who really killed her." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's a hell of an accusation. You got any proof?" "Not yet, but I'm going to find it." He laughed, but not unkindly. Fresh fish always think they're going to prove their innocence. You know how many appeals I've seen get shot down?
How many, guy?
I've watched waste 20 years chasing shadows while their families forget about them. So I should just give up. Saying you should be smart about it. Prison's got its own rules, its own rhythm. You fight the system head on, it'll crush you. But if you're patient, if you learn how things work in here, sometimes you can find cracks. The first week was the hardest. Learning the unwritten rules, understanding the hierarchy, figuring out how to navigate the complex social structure of men who had nothing left to lose. Violence was always present, not constant, but lurking just beneath the surface, ready to explode over something as simple as changing the television channel or taking someone's seat at the wrong table. I kept my head down, spoke when spoken, too, and tried to blend into the background, but word spread quickly about my case. The boyfriend who'd killed his girlfriend and tried to frame it as a break-in. In the brutal logic of prison justice, that made me a particular kind of coward. Pretty boy thinks he's too good for us, I heard one man say during my third day in the yard. Thinks he's some kind of victim. I learned to eat quickly, to always watch my back, to never show weakness or fear. The correction officers treated me with the same indifference they showed everyone else. We were all just numbers to them, bodies to be processed and contained until we died or our sentences ended. My cell assignment paperwork listed my expected release date as LWOP, life without parole. No date, no hope, no future beyond these walls. The document was signed by a corrections officer who'd probably processed thousands of similar forms. Just another piece of bureaucratic machinery in a system designed to warehouse human beings. At night, lying on the thin mattress, listening to the sounds of the prison around me, distant conversations, guard radios crackling, the occasional fight breaking out in another cell, Black Eye thought about Sarah. Not about her death, but about her life, her laugh when I told bad jokes, the way she organized her bookshelf by color instead of title, her obsession with making sure we split dinner checks exactly evenly, down to the penny. And I thought about Detective Walsh, wondering what had driven him to kill the woman I loved, and then destroy my life to cover it up, because I was certain. Now that's what had happened. The evidence had been too perfect, too convenient, too overwhelming to be anything but manufactured. But certainty without proof was just another form of torture. As the weeks turned into months, I realized that Marcus was right. The system was designed to break men like me, to grind down hope until acceptance became the only form of survival. Still, in the darkness of that cell, I made myself a promise. I might die in this place, but I wouldn't die ignorant. Somehow, some way, I was going to find out the truth about what really happened to Sarah. And if I was very lucky, I might even live long enough to do something about it. 3 months into my sentence, Marcus pulled me aside after breakfast with an expression more serious than usual. We'd developed a routine by then, exercising together in the yard, sharing books, talking late into the night about everything except our cases. But this morning was different. You still thinking about proving your innocence? He asked as we walked toward the library. Every day. Then it's time you learned something about this place. The law library isn't just for show. Some of us actually use it. You want to fight back. You need to understand how the system works from the inside. The prison law library was a cramped room filled with outdated legal texts, case law compilations, and a few ancient computers that provided limited access to legal databases. Most inmates avoided it, but a dedicated few spent hours there every day, searching appeals, filing motions, learning to speak the language of the courts. Marcus introduced me to the unofficial leader of this group, a soft-spoken man named Robert Chen, who'd been wrongfully convicted of embezzlement 12 years earlier. Robert had taught himself enough law to become what prisoners called a jailhouse lawyer, helping other inmates with their appeals and legal research. Marcus tells me you think you were framed, Robert said, settling into a chair across from me at one of the library's scarred wooden tables. That's a serious accusation. You got any evidence to back it up? I walked him through my case, the convenient physical evidence, the witnesses who'd changed their stories, the security footage that couldn't quite prove what the prosecution claimed it proved. Robert listened without interruption occasionally, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. The detective who investigated your case, he said when I finished. Raymond Walsh. I've heard that name before. My pulse quickened. Where? Guy named Stevens, released about 6 months ago. He claimed Walsh had planted evidence in his drug case. Nobody believed him, paranoid junkie, you know? But he was very specific about Walsh's methods. Robert pulled out a thick folder from beneath the table. I keep files on questionable cases, patterns that might indicate prosecutorial misconduct or police corruption. Stevens isn't the only one who's complained about Walsh. He showed me photocopied newspaper articles, court transcripts, and handwritten notes about cases where Walsh had been the lead detective. The pattern was subtle, but consistent, overwhelming physical evidence that seemed almost too perfect. Witnesses who changed their stories after talking to police, defendants who maintained their innocence despite evidence that appeared airtight. "Here's what you need to understand," Robert said, leaning forward. "Proving police corruption is nearly impossible from inside prison. The courts don't want to hear it. Prosecutors protect their own, and most judges assume inmates are lying. But that doesn't mean it's hopeless." He handed me a library card, a simple piece of plastic that would give me access to the legal resources I'd need. Start with the basics. Learn criminal procedure, evidence law, constitutional rights. Understand your own case better than your lawyer did. Then start looking for patterns in Walsh's other cases. What kind of patterns? Timeline, inconsistencies, evidence that appeared after initial searches, witnesses who suddenly remembered crucial details, financial records that might show Walsh living beyond his means, and most importantly, any connection between Walsh and the people he supposedly caught. The next few weeks blurred together as I immersed myself in legal research. I read case law until my eyes burned, studied evidence procedures until I could recite them from memory, and slowly began to understand how my own trial had been orchestrated. Every piece of evidence against me had been introduced in exactly the right way, at exactly the right time, to maximum effect. But it was when I started researching Walsh's other cases that the real picture began to emerge. In the past 5 years, he'd had an unusually high conviction rate, nearly 90%, with most of his cases built on overwhelming physical evidence. His clearance rate was the best in the department, making him a media darling and a favorite of prosecutors. "Look at this," I said to Marcus one evening, spreading photocopied documents across my bunk. "Walsh has solved 14 major cases in the past 3 years. 14. The average detective solves maybe 6 or 7. Marcus examined the papers. Maybe he's just good at his job, or maybe he's good at creating crimes to solve. Look at the pattern. Every major case involves physical evidence that appears days or weeks after the initial investigation. Key witness changes their story after talking to Walsh privately, and in every case, the defendant maintains their innocence. That could be coincidence. Could be. But here's what's interesting in each case. The victim was either investigating financial irregularities, working in law enforcement, or had some connection to city government. Sarah was a forensic accountant. The week before she died, she'd been asking questions about police department budget discrepancies. Marcus looked up from the documents. "You think Walsh has been killing people who got too close to something he's involved in? I think Walsh is part of something bigger. Corruption. Network that includes police, prosecutors, maybe even judges. And when someone threatens to expose it, they eliminate the threat and frame a convenient suspect." It was a paranoid theory, the kind of conspiracy thinking that marked you as a crank in most circles. But as I lay in my cell that night, staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the evidence I'd reviewed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was onto something. The law library card in my wallet felt like a weapon now. The first tool I'd found that might help me fight back against the system that had destroyed my life. I wasn't just another inmate anymore, serving time for a crime I didn't commit. I was an investigator, pursuing the truth from inside a cage. And, for the first time since my arrest, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel in months: hope. 6 months after I'd first entered the law library, I'd accumulated enough legal knowledge to understand just how carefully my case had been constructed. The prosecution had followed every procedural requirement perfectly, dotted every I and crossed every T, creating a conviction that would be nearly impossible to overturn on appeal. But understanding the legal mechanics of my conviction also revealed its weaknesses. Robert had helped me obtain a complete copy of my case file through a Freedom of Information Act request, a thick folder containing police reports, witness statements, evidence logs, and crime scene documentation that I'd never seen in its entirety. "Look at this," I said to Marcus during one of our evening discussions, spreading the documents across the small table in our cell. The initial crime scene report, filed at 6:23 a.m. the morning Sarah's body was found. No mention of the fabric evidence that supposedly came from my shirt. Marcus examined the report. "When does it first appear?" 3 days later, in an amended report filed by Walsh himself, he claims it was overlooked during initial processing due to the small size of the sample. "That's not how crime scenes work," Marcus said. "I've been in enough of them to know you photograph everything, catalog everything, before you move anything. You don't just find new evidence 3 days later." I flipped to another section of the file. Same thing with the security camera footage. The initial canvass of the area around Sarah's apartment found no useful surveillance. But for days later, Walsh discovers footage from a gas station that supposedly shows my car. "Let me see that." Marcus studied the surveillance photos, squinting at the grainy black and white images. "You can barely make out that it's a car, let alone identify the make and model. This wouldn't hold up in most courts." But it didn't need to hold up on its own. Combined with everything else, the fingerprints, the fabric, the witness testimony, it created a picture of overwhelming guilt. We worked through the file methodically, noting every instance where evidence appeared after the initial investigation, every witness whose story had changed between their first statement and their trial testimony. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it, but subtle enough that defense attorneys and judges who weren't specifically searching for planted evidence would miss it entirely. "Here's what I don't understand," Marcus said, pointing to the witness statements. "Your brother Mike initially confirmed your alibi without hesitation. His first statement says you were at the party until at least 1:30 a.m., that you slept on his couch, that your phone was dead all night. But by the time he testifies at trial, he's not sure about the timeline anymore. I'd agonized over this point for months." Walsh convinced him that physical evidence trumps memory. Mike started doubting himself, because a detective with 20 years of experience was telling him that the evidence proved I was lying. But what about the other party guests? They all seemed to change their stories too. That was when I found it buried deep in the supplemental reports, a detail so small I'd missed it in previous readings. Walsh had interviewed each party guest separately, days apart, always after showing them the evidence against me first. "Look at this interview with Tom Rodriguez," I said, pulling out a police report dated a week after my arrest. Walsh shows him crime scene photos, tells him about the fabric evidence and the fingerprints, then asks Tom if he's sure about my behavior at the party. Suddenly, Tom remembers that I seemed agitated and kept checking my phone. Marcus shook his head. "Classic manipulation. Show them evidence that you're guilty, then ask them if they really remember things the way they first said. People start doubting their own memories." But the most damning discovery came when I cross-referenced the timeline of evidence discovery with Walsh's work schedule. According to the departmental logs I'd requested, Walsh had worked alone on several key pieces of evidence collection: the fabric sample, the murder weapon fingerprint analysis, even the security camera footage review. "This is highly irregular," Robert confirmed when I showed him my findings during our next library session. Detective work is supposed to involve multiple officers for chain of custody purposes. The fact that Walsh handled so much evidence alone gives him ample opportunity to plant or manipulate it. Can we prove it? Not from in here. What you've found creates reasonable doubt about the integrity of the investigation, but courts require more than doubt. You need positive proof of misconduct. Robert pulled out a legal brief he'd been working on for another inmate. "Here's what you need to understand about police corruption cases. The blue wall of silence is real. Cops don't testify against other cops. Prosecutors don't prosecute their partners. And judges are reluctant to overturn convictions based on police misconduct allegations. The system protects itself. So what do? You keep digging, document everything, build a case so compelling that the system can't ignore it, and you pray that someone on the outside starts asking the same questions you're asking." That night, I lay in my bunk staring at the case file folder that now represented the most important thing in my world. Every document, every report, the witness statement was a piece of a puzzle that, when assembled correctly, told the story of my innocence and Walsh's guilt. But knowing the truth and proving it were two different things. From inside these walls, with limited resources and no ability to interview witnesses or examine physical evidence, I was fighting a war with only paper weapons against an enemy who controlled the entire battlefield. Still, as I flipped through the pages once more, I felt a grim satisfaction. Whatever Walsh had done to frame me, he hadn't been perfect. It left traces, inconsistencies. Small but significant proof that the evidence against me had been manufactured. Now I just had to figure out how to use that proof to destroy the man who had destroyed my life. 1 year into my sentence, I'd turned my cell into a makeshift research center. The walls were covered with photocopied newspaper articles, timeline charts, and hand-drawn connection maps that would have looked like the work of a conspiracy theorist. To anyone who didn't understand what they were looking at, Marcus had learned to navigate around my growing archive, occasionally helping me spot patterns I'd missed. "You're becoming obsessed with this," he said one evening, watching me arrange articles about Walsh's cases in chronological order across our small floor space. "Obsessed with proving my innocence?" "Yes, I am. I'm not saying stop. I'm saying don't lose yourself in it. I've seen guys go down rabbit holes they never climb out of. But I couldn't stop, because the more I researched Walsh's career, the clearer the pattern became. Over the past 5 years, Detective Raymond Walsh had built a reputation as the department's most effective investigator by solving a series of high-profile cases. That had made him untouchable within the system. The newspaper clippings told the story of a dedicated public servant. Detective Walsh solves cold case murder. Walsh's investigation leads to drug ring bust. Veteran detective's work brings justice to victim's family. The local media loved him. Prosecutors requested him specifically for difficult cases, and department brass held him up as an example of old-school police work. But when I examined those cases individually, disturbing patterns emerged. James Morrison, convicted of killing his business partner in what prosecutors called a dispute over company finances. Morrison had maintained his innocence, claimed the evidence was planted, and died in prison 3 years into his sentence. His case file showed the same irregularities as mine evidence that appeared days after the initial investigation. Witnesses whose stories changed after talking to Walsh privately. Angela Rodriguez, a city auditor, convicted of murdering her supervisor. After allegedly being caught embezzling funds, she'd been found guilty based largely on financial documents discovered in her apartment documents she swore had been planted there. Her appeals had been denied, and she was serving life without parole in the women's facility across the state. David Kim, a police officer who'd been investigating corruption in the evidence room before being framed for selling confiscated drugs. His conviction had been based on surveillance footage that his lawyer claimed was edited and witness testimony from criminals who'd received reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation. Each case followed the same template: a victim who was investigating or threatening to expose something, overwhelming physical evidence that appeared after the initial investigation, and a defendant who maintained their innocence despite evidence that seemed airtight. "Look at this," I said to Robert during one of our library sessions, spreading out a map of the city with red pins, marking the locations of Walsh's major cases. Every single victim lived or worked within a 3-mile radius of police headquarters. Every single suspect had some connection to law enforcement, city government, or financial oversight. Robert studied the map. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Walsh isn't just a corrupt cop. I think he's an enforcer for a larger operation. Someone who eliminates threats and frames convenient suspects to keep the heat off the real criminals." "That's a serious accusation. You got any proof?" I pulled out another folder, this one containing financial records I'd obtained through public information requests. "Walsh bought a house worth $400,000 3 years ago. His police salary is $65,000 a year. His wife doesn't work. Where'd the money come from? Maybe he inherited it. Maybe he won the lottery. Maybe. But look at this. He's taken expensive vacations to Europe twice in the past 2 years. Drives a BMW that costs more than his annual salary, and sends his kids to private school. That's not a police detective's lifestyle." Robert was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents. "Even if you're right, proving it from in here is going to be nearly impossible. You need someone on the outside to follow the money trail. Interview witnesses, dig into city records." "I know. But I'm building a case that someone will eventually have to take seriously. Every detail, every inconsistency, every piece of evidence that doesn't make sense when you assume I'm guilty, but makes perfect sense when you assume Walsh is corrupt." That night, I wrote letters to investigative journalists at every major newspaper within 200 miles of the city. Most would probably ignore them letters from convicted murderers claiming police corruption were hardly uncommon. But I included enough specific details, enough documentation, enough verifiable facts that maybe one journalist would see what I was seeing. I also wrote to innocence projects, civil rights organizations, and legal aid societies. The letters took weeks to compose, each one carefully crafted to present my case in the most compelling and credible way possible. I knew I might only get one chance to capture someone's attention, so every word had to count. Marcus helped me review the letters before I sent them, checking for anything that might mark me as a crank or a conspiracy theorist. "You sound sane," he said after reading my letter to the State Innocence Project. "That's more than most guys in here can manage. You think anyone will listen? Honestly? Probably not. But you're building something here, Cory. Even if no one believes you now, someday someone might. And when they do, you'll have given them everything they need to see the truth." As I sealed the letters and prepared to send them out into a world that had already judged me guilty, I thought about Sarah. She'd been a forensic accountant, someone who made her living finding discrepancies in financial records, uncovering fraud that others had tried to hide. In a way, I was following in her footsteps, using the same methodical approach, same attention to detail, the same refusal to accept easy answers. Walsh had killed her to stop her investigation, then framed me to cover his tracks. But he'd underestimated both of us. Sarah had been smart enough to discover his corruption, and I was proving stubborn enough to expose it. Even from inside a prison cell, the newspaper clippings stared back at me from the wall, dozens of articles praising Detective Walsh's dedication and effectiveness. But I knew what those articles really documented: the career of a killer who'd turned law enforcement into his personal weapon, destroying innocent lives to protect his criminal empire. Soon, I hoped the world would know it too. 18 months into my sentence, I'd stopped expecting responses to the dozens of letters I'd sent. Journalists, lawyers, and advocacy groups had either ignored me completely or sent form letters explaining that they couldn't take on new cases. I was beginning to accept that my research might die with me when the notification came during mail call. "Brandon, legal visit," the guard shouted, causing several inmates to look up from their conversations. Legal visits were rare for lifers. Most of us had exhausted our appeals and resigned ourselves to dying behind bars. As I walked to the visiting room, I tried not to get my hopes up. It was probably just paperwork related to some civil matter, or perhaps a paralegal following up on one of my many information requests. The woman waiting for me was in her 30s, Asian American, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately commanded respect. She wore a press badge from the Metro Herald. Her visitor log entry identified her as Maya Chano, relation to Sarah. She clarified quickly, though the coincidence had initially caught her attention. "Mr. Brandon, I'm Maya Chen, investigative journalist with the Herald. I received your letter about Detective Walsh and your case. I have to tell you, 99% of the letters I get from inmates go straight into the trash, but yours was different." My heart started racing. "Different how?" "You included specific details that checked out. Financial records that are publicly available but that most people wouldn't know how to find. Timeline inconsistencies that I was able to verify through police reports. You wrote like someone who actually understood the evidence, not like someone grasping at straws." Maya opened a tablet and pulled up what looked like a detailed outline. "I've been investigating police corruption for 3 years. Your letter mentioned patterns in Walsh's cases that I'd started to notice independently. When I looked deeper, I found things that concerned me." "What kind of things?" "Walsh's conviction rate is statistically impossible. No detective solves 90% of their major cases, unless they're either the luckiest man alive or they're creating their own evidence." I started pulling case files, talking to defense attorneys, interviewing family members of people Walsh convicted. "The pattern you identified is real." I leaned forward, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. "You believe me?" "I believe the evidence. And the evidence suggests that Detective Raymond Walsh has been framing innocent people for years." Swiped to another page on her tablet. "Tell me about Sarah's work. You mentioned she was investigating financial irregularities before her death. She was a forensic accountant with Morrison and Associates. The week before she died, she'd been working late, staying up until midnight, going through files. She said someone was cooking the books, but she couldn't figure out who or how. Did she mention which client she was investigating? Not specifically, but she said it involved city contracts, something about payments that didn't match the services. Provided she was excited about it, Sarah loved solving puzzles, and this was a big one." Maya made notes on her tablet. "The city's been involved in several corruption scandals over the past few years. Inflated contracts, kickbacks to contractors, money disappearing from various departments. Sarah stumbled onto something that implicated police officers or city officials that could be motive for murder. She showed me a photograph on her tablet, a surveillance image from a parking garage. This was taken 2 days before Sarah's death. That's her car in the background. And that's Detective Walsh getting into his vehicle 3 spots away. According to the timestamp, this was taken at 11:30 p.m. outside the Morrison and Associates building. The implications hit me like a physical blow. He was following her. It appears so. Sarah stayed late that night, according to building security logs. Walsh was watching her, probably trying to figure out what she'd discovered. Maya pulled up another document. I've also been looking into Walsh's finances. The house, the cars, the private school tuition, it's all real, and it's all far beyond what a detective's salary could support. But I need more than financial irregularities. To build a story, I need evidence of actual crimes. What can I do from in here? Keep doing what you've been doing. Your research has been invaluable. You understand Walsh's methods better than anyone because you've experienced them firsthand. But I need you to be more specific about Sarah's work. The teeny files she might have brought home, any conversations about specific clients or projects. I thought back to those final weeks with Sarah, trying to remember details I'd dismissed as work stress at the time. She mentioned something about pattern analysis, comparing billing records across multiple city departments. She said the same consulting companies kept winning contracts, but their work quality was inconsistent with their reputations. That's exactly the kind of thing that could get someone killed. Sarah uncovered a kickback scheme involving police department contracts. Walsh would have been in a position to know about it and to silence her before she reported it. Maya closed her tablet and leaned back in her chair. Mr. Brandon, I want to be clear about what I'm offering here. I can't promise to prove your innocence. That's going to require legal action that's beyond my capabilities. But I can investigate Walsh's corruption and publish stories that might pressure authorities to take a closer look at his cases. That's more than anyone else has offered. It's also dangerous. If Walsh really is what we think he is, then investigating him puts both of us at risk. He's already killed at least once to protect his secrets. He won't hesitate to do it again. As Maya gathered her materials and prepared to leave, I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost 2 years. Hope mixed with genuine fear. Hope that someone finally believed me, that the truth might eventually come to light. Fear that Maya might become Walsh's next victim, that my quest for justice might get another innocent person killed. Miss Chen, I said as she stood to go, be careful. Walsh is smart and he's connected. He's been getting away with this for years because he knows how the system works. I've been investigating corrupt cops for 3 years, Mr. Brandon. I know how to protect myself. She paused at the door. But thank you for the warning. Thank you for doing the hard work of documenting Walsh's crimes. Without your research, I never would have seen the pattern. As the guard led me back to my cell, I felt lighter than I had since my arrest. For the first time, I wasn't fighting alone. Maya Chen represented something I'd lost hope of finding. It's an ally on the outside who had the resources and credibility to take on. Detective Walsh. The visitor log entry would show that Maya had spent 2 hours with me, but I knew those 2 hours might have changed everything. Solitary investigation had become a partnership, and Walsh's years of unopposed corruption were about to face their first real challenge. Maya's second visit came 3 weeks later, and the moment I saw her expression, I knew she'd found something significant. She carried a thick folder and looked like someone who hadn't slept in days, the haunted look of a journalist who'd uncovered a story bigger than she'd expected. We need to talk, she said without preamble. What I found about Walsh is worse than either of us imagined. She opened the folder and pulled out a series of bank statements that had been redacted in places, but still showed clear patterns of deposits and transfers. These are Walsh's financial records going back 5 years. I had to use sources I can't name and methods I can't discuss, but they're legitimate. The numbers were staggering. Regular deposits of $10,000 to $15,000, always in cash. Always within days of major cases being closed. Transfers to offshore accounts, payments to shell companies. A financial profile that looked nothing like a civil servant's legitimate income. Where's the money coming from? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. That's where it gets interesting. Been mapping Walsh's deposits against city contract awards, police department seizures, and evidence room inventory discrepancies. Every time Walsh makes a large deposit, it corresponds to one of 3 things: a major drug bust where cash evidence goes missing, a city contract awarded to a company with ties to organized crime, or a case where the defendant's assets are seized and later disappear from police custody. Maya showed me a timeline she'd created, with Walsh's financial activity plotted against significant events in his caseload. Look at this pattern. September 2019, Walsh leads a raid that seizes $200,000 in drug money. Official records show only $50,000 was logged into evidence. 3 days later, Walsh deposits $15,000 in cash. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. It's not just framing innocent people. He's stealing evidence, taking bribes, and using his position to eliminate anyone who threatens to expose the operation. It gets worse. I've identified at least 6 people who were investigating various aspects of city corruption before they were arrested or died under suspicious circumstances. Sarah was just the latest in a pattern that goes back years. Maya pulled out another Documenta Police Department organizational chart with names highlighted in different colors. Walsh doesn't work alone. There's a network of cops, prosecutors, and city officials who are all benefiting from this corruption. When someone gets too close to the truth, they coordinate to eliminate the threat. How many people are we talking about? At least a dozen in the police department alone, plus several prosecutors, a few judges, and multiple city council members. It's not just individual corruption, it's institutional. They've turned law enforcement into a criminal enterprise. The evidence Maya had gathered painted a picture of systemic corruption that went far beyond what I'd imagined. Sarah hadn't just stumbled onto financial irregularities. She'd discovered a criminal conspiracy that reached the highest levels of city government. Here's what I think happened, Maya said, pulling out a photograph of Sarah at her office building. Sarah was investigating city contracts for Morrison and Associates. She discovered that the same companies kept winning bids despite higher costs and poor performance. When she dug deeper, she found evidence that payments were being inflated, and the excess money diverted to private accounts controlled by Walsh and his associates, among others. Sarah's work threatened to expose the entire operation. Someone, probably Walsh, realized what she was investigating and decided she had to be silenced before she could report her findings. Maya showed me copies of Sarah's work computer logs, obtained through her own investigation. Sarah was scheduled to meet with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit the Monday after she was killed. She'd already made an appointment and submitted preliminary evidence of the fraud she'd discovered. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Sarah had been about to expose Walsh's corruption when she was murdered. Her death wasn't random violence or a crime of passion. It was a calculated assassination designed to protect a criminal conspiracy worth millions of dollars. Why didn't this come out during my trial? Because Walsh controlled the investigation. He made sure no one looked into Sarah's work or her scheduled FBI meeting. He portrayed her as a random victim of domestic violence and focused all attention on building a case against you. What? Maya closed the folder and looked at me directly. Cory, what I'm about to tell you is confidential, but I think you have a right to know. I've shared my findings with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. They're opening a formal investigation into Walsh and his associates. For a moment, I couldn't speak. After 2 years of fighting alone, the federal government was finally taking notice of what Sarah had died trying to expose. What does that mean for my case? It means there's hope. If the FBI can prove Walsh's corruption, if they can demonstrate that he framed you to cover up Sarah's murder, then your conviction becomes part of a federal criminal conspiracy case. That's the kind of thing that gets convictions overturned and innocent people released. Maya gathered her materials and prepared to leave. I want you to understand that this is going to take time. Federal investigations move slowly, and Walsh has been careful to cover his tracks. But the evidence is building, and eventually the truth is going to come out. As she stood to go, Maya handed me a business card. That's my direct number. If you remember anything else about Sarah's work, anything that might help the investigation, call me immediately. Walking back to my cell, I felt a mixture of vindication and grief. Vindication that my instincts about Walsh had been correct, that the evidence I'd gathered over 2 years had contributed to exposing his crimes. But grief that Sarah had died for, trying to do the right thing, and that it had taken this long for anyone to believe the truth. That night, I lay in my bunk thinking about the bank statements Maya had shown me, clear evidence that Detective Walsh had been living far beyond his means through criminal activity. Financial records don't lie. These records told the story of a man who'd turned his badge into a license to steal, kill, and destroy innocent lives. But for the first time since my arrest, I felt confident that Walsh's crimes would eventually catch up with him. The FBI was watching now, and Maya's investigation was shining a light on corruption that had thrived in darkness for too long. Justice was coming. It might take time, but it was coming. 3 months after Maya's revelation about the FBI investigation, She returned with news that would finally answer the question that had haunted me for over 2 years: why Sarah had to die. This time, she wasn't alone. A federal agent named David Kim accompanied her, his presence adding an official weight to our meeting. "Mr. Brandon," Agent Kim said, "we've been investigating Detective Walsh's activities for the past 6 months. Miss Chen's research has been invaluable, but we've also developed additional evidence through our own investigation. I'm here because we need your help understanding something we found." Maya opened her laptop and turned it toward me. On the screen was a photograph of Sarah's work computer, not the smashed laptop from her apartment, but her office computer that I'd never known existed. "The FBI recovered this from Morrison and Associates server backups," Maya explained. "It contains files that Sarah had been working on in the weeks before her death. Files that Walsh never knew existed because they were stored on a secure company server, not on her personal laptop." Agent Kim leaned forward. "What we found explains everything. Sarah wasn't just investigating routine financial irregularities. She'd uncovered evidence of a systematic scheme to defraud the city of millions of dollars through inflated police contracts. The first file Maya showed me was a spreadsheet containing contract awards for police equipment purchases over the past 3 years. Body cameras, vehicles, computer systems, weapons, all awarded to companies that charged significantly more than their competitors, but somehow kept winning bids. "Look at this pattern," Maya said, highlighting specific entries. Apex Security Solutions won a contract for body cameras at 200% above the next lowest bid. Stormtech Vehicles charged $50,000 per police car when the standard rate is $35,000. And Advanced Tactical Equipment somehow convinced the department to pay premium prices for standard issue weapons. The kicker is, Agent Kim added, all 3 companies are owned by the same shell corporation, which is controlled by a group of current and former police officers. Walsh is listed as a security consultant for the parent company. Sarah had been methodical in her investigation, documenting not just the inflated contracts, but the paper trail that connected them to specific individuals. Her files contained bank records, corporate filings, and email communications that revealed how the scheme worked. "Here's the smoking gun," Maya said, opening another file. Sarah discovered that the companies were delivering inferior equipment at premium prices, then splitting the excess profits with the cops who approved the contracts. Walsh's cut was substantial, roughly $200,000 a year in consultant fees alone. But it got worse. Sarah's investigation had revealed that some of the equipment purchased through these fraudulent contracts was being resold on the black market. Police weapons ended up in the hands of criminals, surveillance equipment was sold to private security firms, and vehicles were transferred to associates of the conspiracy for personal use. "Sarah documented everything," Agent Kim said. "Shell companies, bank transfers, meetings between Walsh and the contractors, even photographs of police equipment being loaded onto private trucks instead of delivered to the department." Maya scrolled to a file labeled FBI meeting prep that made my chest tighten. Sarah had been preparing for more than just a preliminary meeting. She'd been building a comprehensive case that would have exposed the entire conspiracy. "Look at this," Maya said, pointing to a calendar entry. Sarah had scheduled 3 meetings with different federal agencies: FBI Financial Crimes, IRS Criminal Investigation, and the Department of Justice Public Corruption Unit. Reporting irregularities, she was preparing to blow the whistle on a major criminal enterprise. The scope of Sarah's investigation was breathtaking. She'd identified 17 different fraudulent contracts worth over $8 million in the past 3 years alone. Her files contained evidence that would have resulted in dozens of arrests and the complete restructuring of the police department's procurement process. "This is why Walsh killed her," I said. The pieces finally falling into place. She wasn't just a threat to his side. In come she was about to destroy his entire operation. Agent Kim nodded. Killing her wasn't enough. He had to discredit her investigation by making it look like she was the victim of domestic violence. If her death had been investigated as related to her work, other people would have looked into her files. "But by framing you for her murder," Maya continued, "Walsh ensured that the investigation focused entirely on your relationship with Sarah. No one looked into her work because it wasn't considered relevant to a domestic violence case." The final file Maya showed me was the most damning. Sarah had been tracking payments from the shell companies to various bank accounts, and she'd discovered that the money wasn't just going to police officers, city council members, prosecutors, Even a federal judge had received payments through the fraudulent contract scheme. Sarah stumbled onto a corruption network that goes all the way to the top, Agent Kim explained. Walsh wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was the enforcer for a criminal organization that had infiltrated every level of law enforcement and city government. Maya closed the laptop and looked at me directly. Sarah died because she was about to expose millions of dollars in fraud and dozens of corrupt officials. Walsh killed her to protect not just himself, but an entire criminal conspiracy. The revelation was both vindicating and heartbreaking. Sarah had died a hero, trying to expose corruption that was robbing taxpayers and putting dangerous people in positions of power, but she'd been murdered before she could see justice done. And I'd spent 2 years in prison for the crime of loving someone who'd threatened the wrong people. What happens now? Agent Kim smiled grimly. Now we finish what Sarah started. Her files have given us everything we need to take down Walsh and his associates. The investigation is entering its final phase, and soon, everyone involved in this conspiracy is going to face federal charges, including Walsh for Sarah's murder. Especially Walsh for Sarah's murder. We have evidence now that directly connects him to her death, and with the corruption charges as context, we can prove motive, means, and opportunity. As Maya and Agent Kim prepared to leave, I felt a profound sense of closure about Sarah's death. She hadn't died randomly or senselessly. She died fighting corruption, exposing criminals, trying to make the world a better place. Her work laptop had preserved her investigation even after her death, ensuring that the truth would eventually come to light. That night, I lay in my cell thinking about Sarah's courage. Even knowing the risks, she'd continued her investigation, gathering evidence and preparing to expose people who wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect their secrets. Her dedication to justice had cost her life, but it would ultimately bring down the criminal network that had destroyed so many innocent people, including me. The federal investigation accelerated rapidly once Agent Kim's team had Sarah's files. Maya kept me updated through regular visits, each one bringing news of arrests, indictments, and the systematic dismantling of the corruption network that had destroyed my life. But the breakthrough I'd been waiting for came from an unexpected source. We have a witness, Maya announced during her visit in early spring, nearly 3 years into my sentence. A former police officer named Detective Teresa Alvarez. She's agreed to testify about Walsh's activities in exchange for immunity. Maya pulled out a legal document, a witness statement that would change everything. Alvarez worked with Walsh for 2 years before requesting a transfer. She says she witnessed him planting evidence, coaching witnesses, and coordinating with prosecutors to build cases against innocent people. The statement was devastating in its detail, Alvarez described. Watching Walsh plant the fabric evidence in Sarah's apartment after her body had been discovered, she'd seen him manipulate crime scene photos, coach witnesses about what to say during testimony, and coordinate with the prosecutor's office to ensure that potentially exonerating evidence was never presented to the defense. Why didn't she come forward before? Fear, Maya said simply. Walsh had made it clear that anyone who crossed him would face consequences. Alvarez knew about other officers who'd tried to report corruption and ended up facing disciplinary action or criminal charges themselves. But when the FBI approached her with evidence of the larger conspiracy, she realized she had federal protection. Agent Kim had accompanied Maya to this meeting, and his presence suggested that the investigation was entering a new phase. Detective Alvarez isn't our only cooperating witness, he explained. We've flipped 6 members of the conspiracy so far, including 2 prosecutors and a city council member. Each one is providing testimony about their involvement and Walsh's role as the operations enforcer. The cascade of cooperation was exactly what federal investigators had hoped for. When faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of federal prison, people who'd been loyal to Walsh for years were suddenly eager to share what they knew about his criminal activities. Here's what we've learned, Agent Kim continued, consulting his notes. Walsh has been running this operation for at least 5 years. He's personally responsible for framing 8 innocent people, stealing over $3 million in evidence and seized assets, and coordinating bribes totaling more than $10 million. What about Sarah's murder specifically? Maya leaned forward. Alvarez was present when Walsh received the call about Sarah's FBI meeting. She heard him tell the person on the other end that the accountant problem needs to be resolved permanently. 2 days later, Sarah was dead. The witness statement contained details that only someone present during the conspiracy could have. known. Alvarez described Walsh's methods for planting evidence, his techniques for manipulating crime scenes, and his network of contacts within the prosecutor's office who would ensure that planted evidence was presented effectively at trial. She also provided information about your specific case, Agent Kim said, pulling out another document. Alvarez says Walsh spent 3 days constructing the evidence against you, planted the fabric in Sarah's apartment during the second crime. Scene visit, when he was officially there to collect additional evidence. The security camera footage was edited to remove timestamps that would have proven it couldn't have been your car. Learning the specific details of how Walsh had framed me was both infuriating and vindicating. Every piece of evidence that had seemed so compelling to the jury had been carefully constructed by a man who understood exactly how the system worked and how to manipulate it. What about the other people Walsh framed? Are they getting out? That's the best part, Maya said, her expression brightening for the first time in months. The federal investigation has already resulted in 3 overturned convictions. Angela Rodriguez was released last week after serving 4 years for a murder she didn't commit. James Morrison's family is pursuing a wrongful death lawsuit since he died in prison. David Kemp, the police officer, not the FBI agent, he's being released next month. The scale of justice finally being served was overwhelming. After years of feeling like the only person who understood Walsh's corruption, I was learning that dozens of law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and federal agents were working to undo the damage he'd caused. When will Walsh be arrested? Agent Kim smiled grimly. Zeus. We're coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office to ensure that all charges are filed simultaneously. Walsh, along with 17 co-conspirators, will be arrested in a coordinated operation designed to prevent anyone from destroying evidence or fleeing the jurisdiction. Maya showed me a timeline of the planned arrests. The operation is scheduled for next month. Federal agents will arrest Walsh at his home while simultaneously serving search warrants at his office, his secondary properties, and the offices of all his associates. It's going to be the largest police corruption bust in the city's history. The knowledge that Walsh would finally face justice for his crimes filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't felt since before Sarah's death. But Maya's next words reminded me that justice delayed is justice denied. Cory, your exoneration is going to take more time. Even with all this evidence, the legal process for overturning a conviction is complex. We're looking at months, possibly a year before you're released. I've waited this long, I said. I can wait a little longer to see Walsh get what he deserves. As Maya and Agent Kim prepared to leave, they handed me copies of the witness statements and federal indictments that would soon be unsealed. Reading through them felt like watching the final pieces of a puzzle fall into place. Every question I'd had about my case, every inconsistency I'd identified, every suspicion I'd developed was confirmed by the testimony of people who'd witnessed Walsh's crimes firsthand. That night, I shared the news with Marcus, who'd followed my case closely for 3 years. Sounds like your vindication is finally coming, he said. Not just vindication, justice. For Sarah, for me, for everyone Walsh destroyed over the years. As I lay in my bunk that night, surrounded by the legal documents that would eventually set me free, I thought about how far I'd come from the broken man who'd first entered this cell. I'd transformed myself from victim to investigator, from someone the system had discarded to someone who'd helped expose corruption at the highest levels of law enforcement. Detective Teresa Alvarez's witness statement represented more than just evidence in my case. It was proof that not everyone in law enforcement was corrupt, that some people were still willing to risk their careers and safety to tell the truth. Soon, Walsh would learn what Sarah had known all along, that eventually, the truth always comes to light. The day before Walsh's scheduled arrest, something unexpected happened that would provide the final piece of evidence needed to prove my innocence. The guard who came to my cell during evening count wore an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of confusion and something that might have been respect. Brandon, you have a visitor, says he's Detective Walsh from Metro Police. The words hit me like a physical blow. After 3 years, Walsh was coming to see me in person. Maya and Agent Kim had warned me this might happen. Desperate criminals sometimes tried to intimidate witnesses or gauge how much evidence existed against them. But knowing it was possible and experiencing it were 2 different things. You don't have to see him, the guard continued. Visitor requests can be denied. I thought about it for a moment. Walsh had destroyed my life, killed the woman I loved, and spent 3 years believing he'd gotten away with it. Now, on the eve of his arrest, he wanted to talk. This might be my only chance to look him in the eye and let him know that I'd figured out what he'd done. I'll see him. The visiting room was nearly empty at this time of evening, just a few other inmates meeting with family members, their conversations quiet and subdued. Walsh sat at a table in the corner, wearing civilian clothes, but somehow still radiating the authority of someone accustomed to being in control. When he saw me, his expression shifted to something that might have been satisfaction. "Cory Brandon," he said as I sat down across from him. "You're looking well for someone spending life in prison. Detective Walsh, I have to admit I'm surprised to see you here." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same calculating gaze I remembered from our interviews 3 years ago. "I heard you've been busy, writing letters, filing requests, making accusations. What the jailhouse lawyer, from what I understand, is trying to understand how an innocent man ended up convicted of murder." Walsh's smile was cold and predatory. "Innocent. Cory, the jury heard all the evidence. Your fingerprints on the murder weapon, physical evidence at the scene, witnesses who testified about your behavior. That's not the profile of an innocent man. Evidence can be planted. Witnesses can be coached. Juries can be misled. That's a serious accusation. Are you suggesting that Aja, 20-year veteran of the police force, would fabricate evidence to frame an innocent man?" The conversation felt surreal. Walsh was speaking as if we were still playing the same game we'd played 3 years ago, as if I was still the confused and frightened suspect who'd trusted him to find Sarah's real killer. But I wasn't that person anymore. "I'm not suggesting anything," I said. "I'm stating facts. You killed Sarah because she was about to expose your corruption. Then you framed me to cover your tracks." For the first time, Walsh's composure slipped slightly. His eyes narrowed, and I caught a glimpse of the calculating predator beneath his professional facade. "That's an interesting theory. But theories don't overturn convictions. Evidence does. And all the evidence points to your guilt." "Right. What about Sarah's work computer? The one the FBI recovered from Morrison and Associates server? The one that contains detailed documentation of the fraud scheme you've been running for years?" Walsh went very still. "This was information that hadn't been made public yet. Investigators, Maya, and I knew about Sarah's preserved files." Seeing his reaction confirmed that he had no idea those files existed. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do. Shell companies winning inflated contracts, police equipment being resold on the black market, payments to corrupt officials. Sarah documented everything before you killed her." Walsh leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You're playing a dangerous game, Cory. Even in here, accidents can happen. Inmates get attacked, fall down stairs, have unfortunate encounters with other prisoners. Prison is a dangerous place for someone who talks too much." The threat was unmistakable. But instead of fear, I felt a strange calm. This was the real Raymond Walsh, not the dedicated detective he pretended to be, but a killer who'd eliminated anyone who threatened his criminal enterprise. "Is that what happened to James Morrison? It's an unfortunate encounter? He died in prison after claiming you'd framed him too." Walsh's expression hardened. "Morrison was a convicted murderer who couldn't accept responsibility for his crimes. Just like you. What about Detective Teresa Alvarez? Is she going to have an unfortunate accident too? Because she's already given the FBI a detailed statement about watching you plant evidence at crime scenes?" This time Walsh's reaction was unmistakable. His face went pale, and for a moment the mask of professional authority completely fell away. He looked like exactly what he was, a cornered criminal who just realized his world was collapsing. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. Tomorrow morning, federal agents are going to arrest you for murder, conspiracy, fraud, and corruption. All those years of thinking you were untouchable, all those innocent people you destroyed, it's over, Walsh." Walsh stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This conversation is finished." Actually, it's not. I remained seated, looking up at him with what I hoped was the same cold calculation he'd shown me 3 years ago. "You came here to intimidate me? To see how much I knew? Maybe to gauge whether you needed to arrange for my death before your arrest? But what you've done instead is provide confirmation that everything I suspected about you is true." "What are you talking about?" I smiled, thinking about the small recording device that Maya had arranged for me to carry during this visit, a device approved by the FBI as part of their investigation. "I'm talking about the fact that this entire conversation has been recorded. Your threats, your lack of denial when confronted with specific evidence, your reaction to learning about witnesses you didn't know existed. All of it." Walsh's face contorted with rage. But before he could respond, I continued. You killed Sarah because she was about to expose your crimes. You framed me because you needed a convenient suspect. And now you're going to spend the rest of your life in a cell just like mine, wondering how it feels to be destroyed by someone you thought you'd already beaten. As Walsh stormed out of the visiting room, I felt a profound sense of completion. For 3 years, I'd wondered what I would say to him if I ever got the chance. Now I knew IAD told him the truth. I'd watched his world crumble as he realized that justice was finally coming for him. The prison visitation record would show that. Detective Raymond Walsh had visited Cory Brandon on the evening before his arrest. But what it wouldn't show was that during that visit, Walsh had provided the final piece of evidence needed to ensure his conviction for Sarah's murder. Sometimes, justice comes through courts and appeals and federal investigations. Sometimes, it comes from looking your enemy in the eye and letting him know that he's finally been beaten by the people he thought he'd destroyed. The news reached me during morning count, carried by a guard who couldn't hide his amazement at what had happened overnight. Brandon, you might want to watch the news today. That detective who visited you yesterday, he's all over it. The television. In the common area was already surrounded by inmates when I arrived. On screen, federal agents were leading Detective Raymond Walsh out of his suburban home in handcuffs, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. The banner across the bottom read, Massive Police Corruption, Bust 17 Officials Arrested. The reporter's voice carried clearly across the quiet room, in a coordinated operation that began at dawn. Federal agents arrested Detective Raymond Walsh and 16 associates on charges including murder, conspiracy, fraud, and civil rights violations. The arrests culminate a year-long investigation into what authorities are calling the largest police corruption scandal in the city's history. Watching Walsh's arrest felt surreal after 3 years of imprisonment for his crimes. He was wearing the same expensive clothes that had testified to his corruption, but now his hands were cuffed behind his back, and his future was measured in decades behind bars instead of years of freedom. Maya arrived that afternoon with Agent Kim and a man. I didn't recognize someone in an expensive suit who carried himself with the authority of federal law enforcement. The introduction explained everything. Mr. Brandon, this is Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Rodriguez. He's prosecuting the federal case against Walsh and his associates. Rodriguez opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick document that would change my life. Mr. Brandon, based on evidence uncovered during our investigation, we're filing a motion for new trial in your case. The evidence of Detective Walsh's misconduct is overwhelming, and his recorded confession during yesterday's visit provides the final proof we needed. The motion for new trial was a legal document that represented everything I'd fought for during 3 years of imprisonment. It detailed Walsh's methods for planting evidence, the testimony of cooperating witnesses who'd seen him frame innocent people, and the financial records that proved his corruption. How long before I'm released? I asked, hardly daring to believe this was really happening. The motion will be heard next week, Rodriguez explained. Given the strength of the evidence, I expect the judge will order your immediate release and dismissal of all charges. This isn't just about overturning your conviction. We have proof that you were the victim of a criminal conspiracy. Agent Kim leaned forward. The recording from yesterday's visit was particularly damaging. Walsh's threats, combined with his failure to deny specific accusations, provided confirmation of his guilt that a jury will find compelling. Maya pulled out her tablet and showed me news coverage of the arrests. Walsh isn't the only one facing justice. The whole network is being dismantled. Prosecutors, judges, city officials, everyone who participated in the conspiracy is being held accountable. The scope of the investigation's success was breathtaking. 17 arrests, millions of dollars in stolen assets recovered, and multiple innocent people being released from prison. The corruption that had seemed untouchable for years was crumbling under the weight of federal scrutiny. What about the media coverage? I asked. Extensive, Maya replied. Your case is being portrayed as the key that unlocked the entire investigation. The wrongfully convicted man who refused to give up, who documented Walsh's crimes from prison and helped federal investigators build their case. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 years, I'd been portrayed as a domestic abuser who'd killed his girlfriend in a rage. Now the same media outlets were describing me as a hero who'd helped expose corruption and free other innocent people. There's something else, Rodriguez said, pulling out another document. Walsh's cooperation with federal investigators has been minimal, but several of his associates are providing detailed testimony about his crimes. We expect to charge him with first-degree murder in Sarah's death within the next few days. The knowledge that Walsh would finally face justice for killing Sarah filled me with a satisfaction that was almost overwhelming. For 3 years, he'd lived freely while I rotted in prison for his crime. Soon, our positions would be reversed permanently. What happens to the other people Walsh framed? They're all being reviewed, Agent Kim explained. We've identified 8 cases where Walsh appears to have planted evidence or manipulated witnesses. Each conviction is being examined, and we expect several more exonerations in the coming months. As Maya, Agent Kim, and Rodriguez prepared to leave, the magnitude of what was happening began to sink in. After 3 years of fighting alone, after countless rejected appeals and ignored letters, justice was finally being served, not just for me, but for everyone Walsh had destroyed. One more thing, Rodriguez said as he gathered his documents. City has already indicated they'll be offering substantial settlements to everyone who was wrongfully convicted. Your ordeal is almost over, Mr. Brandon. That evening, I called my parents for the first time in months. My mother cried when I told her about the arrests and the motion for new trial. My father, who'd never stopped believing in my innocence, but had learned to temper his hope, was speechless. It's really over, my mother asked through her tears. It's really over. Walsh has been arrested, and I'm going to be released soon. As I hung up the phone and walked back to my cell, I thought about how much had changed since Walsh's visit the night before. Yesterday, he'd been a free man trying to intimidate a prisoner. Today, he was in custody facing charges that would put him away for the rest of his life. The court filing that would secure my freedom was more than just a legal document. It was vindication for every hour I'd spent researching Walsh's crimes. Every letter I'd written seeking help. Every moment I'd refused to accept that justice was impossible. Marcus was waiting in our cell with a rare smile on his face. Heard the news on the yard? Sounds like you're going home. Looks like it. What's the first thing you're going to do when you get out? I thought about it for a moment. Visit Sarah's grave. Tell her that Walsh is finally going to pay for what he did to her. That night, for the first time in 3 years, I fell asleep. Not as a man wrongfully convicted of murder, but as someone whose fight for justice had finally succeeded. The hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in the same courtroom where I'd been convicted 3 years earlier. Judge Margaret Chen, who had sentenced me to life without parole, now sat listening as Assistant U.S. Attorney Rodriguez presented evidence that would undo everything she'd believed about my case. Your Honor, Rodriguez said, standing before the bench with a folder thick with evidence. The defendant before you today is not a convicted murderer. He is the victim of a systematic conspiracy to obstruct justice, one that included fabricated evidence, perjured testimony, and the murder of the very person Mr. Brandon was accused of killing. The courtroom was packed with reporters. Sarah's family, my parents, and Maya Chen, who documented every step of this journey. In the back, I spotted Detective Teresa Alvarez, whose courage in coming forward had made this moment possible. Rodriguez walked the judge through the evidence methodically. Walsh's financial records proving corruption. The recovered files from Sarah's work computer showing her investigation into police fraud. The testimony of multiple witnesses who'd seen Walsh plant evidence and coach witnesses. Most damning of all, Rodriguez continued, we have a recorded conversation between Detective Walsh and Mr. Brandon, made just days before Walsh's arrest, in which Walsh threatened Mr. Brandon's life and failed to deny specific accusations about his criminal activities. Judge Chen listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, her expression growing more troubled as the scope of Walsh's crimes became clear. When Rodriguez finished his presentation, she was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Brandon, she said finally, please stand. I rose on unsteady legs, my heart pounding as I faced the woman who'd once condemned me to die in prison. The moment felt both eternal and impossibly brief. 3 years ago, I sentenced you to life in prison based on evidence that I believed. Proved your guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Today, I'm presented with overwhelming proof that this evidence was fabricated by the very detective who investigated the case. The court finds that your conviction was the result of prosecutorial misconduct and police corruption of the most egregious kind. She lifted the exoneration order that would change my life forever. Therefore, the court hereby vacates your conviction and dismisses all charges against you. Mr. Brandon, you are free to go. The words echoed in my mind as the courtroom erupted around me. My mother's sobs, my father's shouts of joy, Maya's applause, and the rapid clicking of camera shutters documenting my vindication. But through it all, I felt a strange calm, as if some part of me had always known this moment would come. The processing took another hour, returning my personal effects, completing paperwork, officially changing my status from prisoner to free citizen. When the corrections officer handed me the box containing my wallet, watch, and grandmother's cross, it felt like reclaiming pieces of my identity that had been stolen 3 years ago. "You did it," Marcus said, as I prepared to leave. He'd been transferred to the courthouse for his own hearing and had witnessed my exoneration. "You proved them all wrong. We did it," I corrected. "None of this would have been possible without your help, without Robert's legal guidance, without Maya's investigation." As I walked out of the courthouse as a free man, the afternoon sunlight felt different than it had through prison windows, brighter, warmer, full of possibility. Maya was waiting on the steps with a recording device and questions about my plans. "How does it feel to be free?" she asked. "Overwhelming," I admitted. 3 years ago, I was just a man who'd lost the woman he loved. Today, I'm someone who helped expose the corruption that killed her. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I've earned. My parents drove me to the cemetery where Sarah was buried. Her headstone was simple, just her name, dates, and the inscription "Beloved Daughter and Seeker of Truth." I'd brought flowers, but mostly I just wanted to sit beside her grave and tell her what had happened. "He's in custody now," I said, kneeling beside the headstone. "Walsh and all his associates. They're going to spend the rest of their lives in prison for what they did. Your investigation didn't die with you, Sarah. It just took a little longer." To reach the right people, I stayed until sunset, telling Sarah about the past 3 years, about the research I'd done, about Maya's investigation and the federal case that had brought Walsh to justice. As darkness fell, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't experienced since her death. The drive home took me past places that had been important in my old life. The restaurant where Sarah and I had our first date, the apartment building where we'd lived, the office where she'd worked as a forensic accountant. Everything looked the same, but I was fundamentally different. 3 years in prison had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I was harder now, more suspicious of authority, more aware of how easily the system could be corrupted. But I was also more determined, more focused, and more committed to ensuring that what happened to me never happened to anyone else. The exoneration order that had freed me was more than just a legal document. It was proof that justice, however delayed, was still possible. That innocent people could fight back against corruption and win. The truth, however buried, would eventually surface. That night, I slept in my childhood bedroom at my parents' house, in a bed that felt impossibly soft after 3 years of prison mattresses. Through the window, I could see stars that had been invisible through the concrete and steel of Millfield State Penitentiary. For the first time since Sarah's death, I wasn't planning my next move in a legal battle or preparing to fight for my freedom. I was simply a man who'd been given his life back. With the chance to decide what to do with the years that had been stolen from me, the fight for justice was over. I had to figure out how to live with the victory. 6 months after my release, I stood in the lobby of the new Innocence Advocacy Center, watching construction workers install the final piece of signage. The center would provide legal resources for wrongfully convicted individuals, investigative support for questionable cases, and training for defense attorneys on recognizing planted evidence and prosecutorial misconduct. The civil settlement with the city had been substantial $8 million for 3 years of wrongful imprisonment, plus punitive damages for the systematic violation of my constitutional rights. More importantly, the settlement included provisions for police department reform, mandatory recording of all interrogations, and independent oversight of evidence collection procedures. Maya Chen had become my partner in this endeavor, transitioning from investigative journalist to executive director of the center. Her Pulitzer Prize-winning series on the Walsh corruption scandal had brought national attention to the problem of police misconduct and wrongful convictions. "The Forensic Evidence Review Program goes live next week," Maya said, joining me in the lobby with a tablet full of updates. "We already have requests from 12 inmates claiming their cases involve planted evidence similar to yours." The center's mission was both personal and universal, preventing what happened to me from happening to others, while providing hope for those already trapped in the system. We'd hired former prosecutors who specialized in conviction integrity, investigators with experience in police corruption cases, and attorneys dedicated to post-conviction relief. Any word on Walsh's trial? I asked. Jury selection starts next month. The prosecution is confident they have his recorded threats. To you, Teresa Alvarez's testimony about watching him plant evidence and Sarah's work files proving motive. His lawyer is already talking about a plea deal. Detective Raymond Walsh had been indicted on 17 federal charges, including first-degree murder in Sarah's death. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but seeing him in court would provide final closure to the nightmare he'd created. I walked into my office, where the walls were covered with photographs of people we'd helped secure releases for. Angela Rodriguez, freed after serving 6 years for a murder Walsh had committed and pinned on her. David Kim, the police officer who'd been framed for drug dealing after investigating evidence room corruption. 3 others whose convictions had been overturned based on evidence of Walsh's misconduct. The civil settlement agreement hung on the wall. Behind my desk, not just a legal document, but a symbol of accountability. The city had admitted no wrongdoing, but they'd agreed to pay millions in damages and implement reforms designed to prevent future corruption. More importantly, they'd established a fund for other victims of Walsh's crimes. Mr. Brandon. My assistant's voice came through the intercom. You have a visitor. Says he's from the Department of Justice.
Hey.
The visitor was Agent Kim, who'd become a friend over the months since Walsh's arrest. He carried a folder that I recognized as containing updates on the ongoing federal investigation. How many people do you think Walsh framed over his career? I asked as he settled into a chair across from my desk. Based on what we've found so far, at least 12, possibly more. The pattern goes back almost to the beginning of his career planted. Evidence, coached witnesses, manufactured cases against people who threatened his operations. The scope of Walsh's crimes was still being discovered. Each overturned conviction led to new investigations. New evidence of systematic corruption that had infected every level of law enforcement in the city. There's something else, Agent Kim said, pulling a document from his folder. Walsh's lawyer contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office this morning. He wants to make a deal full cooperation in exchange for life without parole instead of the death penalty. The possibility of Walsh escaping execution for Sarah's murder should have bothered me. But I learned that justice wasn't always about punishment. It was about truth, accountability, and ensuring that victims were heard. What would his cooperation involve? Everything. Names of everyone he worked with, details of every crime, locations of evidence that was never recovered. His testimony could help us overturn dozens more wrongful convictions and recover millions in stolen assets. That afternoon, I visited Marcus Williams, who'd been released 2 months earlier when new evidence surfaced in his case. He was working construction and living in a halfway house, adjusting to freedom after 12 years of imprisonment. Strange. How things work out, he said, as we sat in a coffee shop near his job site. Came into that cell convinced you were innocent, and you ended up proving it not just for yourself, but for all of us. Sarah proved it, I corrected. Her investigation provided the evidence that brought Walsh down. I just refused to let her work be forgotten. You did more than that. You turned your suffering into something that helped other people. That's not something everyone could do. As evening approached, I drove to the cemetery where Sarah was buried. It had become a weekly ritual visiting her grave, updating her on the center's progress, telling her about the people we'd helped secure freedom for. Walsh's trial starts next month, I said, arranging fresh flowers beside her headstone. His lawyer thinks he'll take a plea deal. Life in prison, full cooperation with federal investigators. It's not the death penalty, but it's justice. Sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds. In the distance, I could see the city skyline, including the building where Sarah had worked as a forensic accountant. Her investigation into police corruption had cost her life, but it had also exposed a criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity for years. The center is going to help a lot of people, I continued. We've already freed 6 innocent people, and we're just getting started. Your work didn't die with you, Sarah. It's living on in every person we help, every case we investigate, every truth we uncover. As I prepared to leave, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years of imprisonment, months of investigation, and the systematic destruction of my old life had led to something I'd never expected, a new purpose, a new mission, and a new understanding of what justice really meant. The civil settlement agreement had given me the resources to build something lasting. Sarah's investigation had provided the foundation. My experience as a wrongfully convicted person had given me the perspective to understand what other victims needed. Standing beside Sarah's grave, as darkness fell, felt a profound sense of completion. The man who'd been arrested 3 years ago for her murder was gone, destroyed by false accusations and corrupted evidence. In his place was someone harder, wiser, and more committed to fighting injustice wherever it appeared. Detective Raymond Walsh had tried to destroy my life to cover his crimes. Instead, he'd created someone dedicated to exposing corruption and freeing the innocent. The Innocence Advocacy Center would be his legacy to proof that evil, however powerful, could never completely triumph over truth. Some stories of injustice end in bitterness and defeat. But mine ended with the kind of justice that restores faith in what's possible when you refuse to give up hope. Even when the system itself has abandoned you, Walsh would spend the rest of his life in prison. Sarah's killers had been brought to justice. And innocent people who might otherwise have died behind bars would have a chance at freedom. That was justice enough for anyone.